Our mission is advancing better governance in the public interest, which we accomplish by helping to explore, develop, and promote the principles, standards, and practices which underlie good governance in the public sphere, both in Canada and through our extensive practice abroad. The IOG's vision is to be the preeminent, independent Canadian source of knowledge, research, and advice on governance, and most importantly, its continuous improvement, because it is a moving target. Over the past 20 years, we have advanced better understanding and practices of good governance, and we've undertaken over 1,000 projects in 35 countries around the globe. Our work, as I have said, is marked by independent thought. We like to think, and so do our clients, innovation, collaboration, excellence, and a responsive and principled approach. In recent decades, governance has come to be acknowledged as a key success factor in governments, organizations, and indeed in democracies and how they function. As central issues have grown more complex and interrelated, historical models of government and the governance that support them have been revealed to be too reliant on expertise organized in silos, and these silos can't work as effectively as the requirements of the complex situations. This has had an enormous impact on the potential for more holistic outcomes, because government, at the end of the day, is about outcomes. As such, important issues such as environment, security, poverty, wealth distribution, and more importantly, wealth creation, and health all require better governance. Citizen cynicism and the lack of engagement in current governance models and practices further add to the challenges that we collectively face in society. Technology and expectations towards greater transparency and accountability are all putting additional pressures on structures of the day. Evolving models of governance are essential to effectively address these challenges. Awareness of the topic of governance has grown in and across all sectors of society. Within governments, measures of accountability have increased exponentially in the last decade, and these measures have extended to the not-for-profit sector as well, where leadership and governance are being addressed with greater frequency and seriousness by all organizations, regardless of their size. In addition, the public has become ever more attuned to the fact that good governance is a requirement for all institutions and organizations. The IOG is uniquely positioned as a truly independent public purpose organization to help fill this need for knowledge, research, and advice on good governance. And today, speaking to the IOG, we have two of our board members with us. We have Terry Ansari with us, who's made the trip from Ottawa. Terry is a Vice President of Business Solutions with Cisco and joined our board about 5 months ago. Judith Wright, who is the Deputy Minister for Health Promotion and Sports from the Ontario Government, is also one of our board members and is here with us today. And now to the reason why we're here. 40 years ago, in 1970, the Ontario Government's Committee on Government Productivity produced an innovative report on how the management of government could be made more efficient, more effective, and more responsive. This work, directed later by Ontario Cabinet Secretary James D. Fleck, was groundbreaking and to this day has stood the test of time as one of the most thorough investigations of government ever conducted. However, now at the 40th anniversary of this report, and with a rapidly changing economic, technological, and demographic environment around us, it is clear that providing what citizens and businesses expect in this new environment goes beyond the competencies and capacities of traditional governance and bureaucratic practices. It is once again time to re-examine the subject of government modernization and of how we best implement government policies and deliver services to the citizens of Ontario and Canada. I am proud to announce today that the Institute on Governance is launching a new research program on modernizing government named in honor of the leader of the work that predates current efforts by 4 decades, Dr. James D. Fleck. The Fleck Program on Modernizing Government will conduct an ongoing research on the topic of modernizing government, its management and governance, as well as the dialogue that surrounds these important issues in the public sphere, because after all, this is the age of collaboration and partnership. But before we hear from the great man himself, and I will say a few moments later about management in government, the past, present, and future, let me introduce the other two discussants and finish with the grand finale of Jim Fleck. Rita Burak was appointed chair of Hydro One in May of 2003. She's also director of the Equitable Life Insurance Company of Canada and president of a consulting partnership, the Network Executive Team. She's a member of the University Health Network Board of Trustees and of the TELUS Ontario Advisory Committee and chair of the Toronto Community Board. The reason we know her work so well comes from the time when she was the Secretary of the Cabinet and Clerk of the Executive Council. That's from 1995 to 2000, I believe, Rita. Before that, she was also Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. She holds a degree from York University, and in 2001 was the recipient of the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario's Medal of Distinction in Public Administration. She is also a member of the Order of Ontario and received the Public Policy Forum's Annual Testimonial Award in 2004. For a while, she even filled in as the chairman for eHealth when her province needed her. We'll hear more from Rita in a few moments. The second discussant is Danielle Jean. Danielle was appointed Deputy Minister of the Administrative Services Review, attached to the Privy Council office, after the last federal budget in April this year. He's more recently been appointed, we think as a reward for the great work he's done in the last 8 months, as the Deputy Minister of Heritage Canada. He joined the Canadian Public Service through the Canadian Foreign Service in the immigration stream in 1982. He served all over the world, and including in Haiti during the Jean-Bertrand Aristide period, and spent 5 years as the immigration counselor at our Canadian Embassy in Washington. He then returned to Ottawa and to the Department of Immigration, where he was responsible for policy and program development, and finally for operations, where he learned about many of the things that no doubt he's been practicing in greater scale in the last 8 months. In 2007, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Board, where he had responsibilities for a vast array of areas, including the international, security and justice, and then moved as a result of that work to the Privy Council office, where he became Deputy Secretary to Cabinet for Operations. He's a graduate of the University of Ottawa and State University of New York at Buffalo. And Danielle will be our second discussant. And now let me say a few words about the man in whose honor this evening is named. He was born in Toronto not too many years ago, because he's still in the greatest shape of just about anybody in the room. He was educated at the University of Toronto Schools, moved on to Western Ontario, where again he was a gold medalist, went on to Harvard, was awarded a doctorate of business administration and finance there, where he did a doctoral thesis on investment policies of Canadian life insurance companies. He was also awarded a Doctor of Law honoris causa by the University of Toronto in 2002. And just to begin, because one has to take selectively, otherwise I'll use up the entire hour and a half describing what Jim has done. But for those of you who might be new to him, and that's not many of you, let me just say that one of his claims to fame, and I remember this as a young girl growing up and listening to the news in the morning in Toronto, he was a chairman and CEO of Fleck Manufacturing, a company he helped found in 1954. He was also the chairman of many, many other companies and director of public and private companies, including Rogers, Multimedia, Zurich, Travelers, Channel 47, in those golden days when that kind of television was being formed in this province and in this country, and Colonial Homes. He's been active with the Young Presidents Organization and was its international president in 1972-73. As an academic, because he's that too, Professor Fleck is the Emeritus M. Wallace McCutcheon Professor of Business Government Relations at the Faculty of Management here at the University of Toronto. He's also a Senior Fellow of Massey College. He has many, many publications to his name, and I won't begin to do them justice here. He's also taught at Harvard, both in the MBA program and as the Lyon Mackenzie King Visiting Professor at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's also taught at the University of Western Ontario, in Japan, in France. And when he returned to Toronto, he helped establish the faculty administration at York University. In terms of his public engagements, Mr. Fleck is chairman of the Council for Business and the Arts in Canada, which is why he's so well known across the country in this guise today. He's also been chairman of the Ontario Ministers Advisory Council on Arts and Culture, president of the Art Gallery of Ontario Foundation, Harbourfront, and it goes on and on and on, with his abiding love for tennis as well. He's worked in the collaboration of public and private partnerships, where collaborating with the City of Toronto, he helped create and build the Yo-Yo Ma Toronto Music Garden, inspired by the music of Bach. A true Renaissance man, learned in the arts and a poet, and a lover of great music. He's also a member of the Chief Executive Organization and the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. But we're here today to reflect on another part of Jim's service to his country. From 1969 to 1971, he was Executive Director and a member of the Committee on Government Productivity, responsible for carrying out the study that led to a major reorganization of the Ontario government. Prior to joining this initiative, he served on the Federal Department of Transport Task Force on Goals and Objectives. In 74 and 75, he was the Secretary of the Cabinet. And Jim, I think it's a testament to what you've done that not only are there two former Secretary of the Cabinets as discussants on this panel, yourself and Rita, but there are two others in the room, with Bob Carman being present and with Tony Dean also here to honor your work. Before he became Secretary of the Cabinet, he was also the Chief Executive Officer for the Office of the Premier. Before that, he was also the Deputy Minister of Industry and Tourism. It goes on and on and on. But these days, in terms of his achievements, he's very well known for the kind of work he's done in setting up the Canadian Arts Summit, bringing together volunteer, artistic, and administrative heads of the 50 largest visual and performing arts institutions, where he served as chairman of the Second Art Summit in 1999. He was also, Shelley Ernworth is here to honor Jim, a founding director of the Public Policy Forum. He was active in the Niagara Institute and chairman of BCNI's Steering Committee on Constitutional Reform, again when his country needed help. And he was a director of the Institute for Research on Public Policy. He's done many, many things, and in 1996, in part for some of these things, of the short list I've read out, he's received the Public Policy Forum Testimonial Award for Distinguished Service to Canada. He also received the Edmund C. Bovey Award for Leadership Support of the Arts in Canada in 2003. He's also been inducted as a builder into Canada's Tennis Hall of Fame. And in 2009, in what was a great thing that was seen across the nation, he was the recipient of the Raymond John Natition Award for Volunteerism in the Performing Arts at the Governor General's Awards in Ottawa. He's also been presented the Queen's Silver Jubilee Medal in 1977 and the Queen's 50th Anniversary Medal in 2002. And to cap all of this, he is an Officer of the Order of Canada, was appointed in 1997. We're here today because he continues to give tirelessly and with great distinction to his country and his community, the arts he loves so much, and the continuous improvement of his country across many facets. He is a true Renaissance man and a living nation builder. As we will look 10 and 20 years into the future, and as we will honor others in his name, they will also be selected to celebrate excellence in modernizing government, as they will have walked in Jim's very large footsteps in service to their country. We are very pleased at the Institute on Government that he has lent his name to this work that begins today through the Fleck Program on Modernizing Government. And now, without further ado, because we could say so much more about him, let me turn to Jim to announce the first, as we like to say at the IOG offices, the first Fleckture of the modern age. Thank you.
Mary Antoinette must have gotten the long CV. Sorry about that. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased to be working with Mary Antoinette and the Institute on Governance on this research program that will look at the future of government and, most important, how changing technology, demographics, and economic factors may enable a long-term transformation of how government processes and services are delivered, a transformation that we've been seeking for many decades and that has come closer to fruition than ever before, but we've still much work to do to ensure that the citizens of this province and the country receive the services and value they desire. The opening remarks by Chairman John Cronin in the Management of Government, a reappraisal, which I think I have here, a little booklet, that introduced the Committee on Government Productivity, some would say an oxymoron, commonly known as COGP, some 40 years ago, reads as follows. Management today requires a high capacity for innovation. This is achieved not only through new technology, but more importantly through imaginative thinking. It demands imagination, inventiveness, foresight, adaptability, and willingness to try new ways of dealing with new problems and opportunities. That was 40 years ago. Today, the challenges of governing remain very much the same. Technology and economic structures may have evolved, but the fundamental demands placed on those who govern have not. In fact, 40 years later, the principles and responsibilities which John Cronin, myself, and many others were tasked with on the COGP in 1970 are very similar to the challenges and necessities of change present in the province today. Hence, I'd like to spend a few minutes reviewing the work of the COGP, its key recommendations, why it was transformational, and how the lessons and insights from that process, as well as others from around the world, might be reapplied, reformulated, or retrofitted to fit today's need for change. The COGP was appointed by then Premier John Robarts with a very broad mandate. And Danielle, I don't know if yours is as broad as this or not, but to inquire into all matters pertaining to the management of the Government of Ontario and to make such recommendations as, in its opinion, will improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the Government of Ontario. Hard to get broader than that. The committee was an inside-outside exercise made up of 5 corporate CEOs, and I should say of those 5 corporate CEOs, Jerry Heffernan is with us still today, with a knowledge of private sector management practices, and 5 senior deputy ministers schooled in the knowledge of the art of the possible and the different needs of the public sector. Led by John Cronin, a close colleague of Premier Robarts and a senior executive at Labatt's, who passionately and selflessly strove to improve management and government, and directed by myself, a businessman academic. This combination of individuals from both outside and inside the public service proved in retrospect to be one of the committee's major strengths. The outsiders brought a freshness of approach and an objectivity to the analysis of problems. These qualities, combined with the insiders' knowledge of the system and their determination to make new changes work, created a change agent whose potential, in my view, far exceeded that of more traditional forms of organizational analysis. The principle of combining outsiders and insiders was also followed in establishing the committee's central staff, its project teams, and advisory groups. Also emerging from this initial period of naval contemplation was a determination on the part of the committee to be action-oriented. From our review of previous studies, it became clear that a major shortcoming of many past efforts at management appraisal in government was on the implementation side. Voluminous final reports were produced which were largely ignored. I suppose this should not surprise many of us. We are fully aware of how difficult it is to effect change in large organizations. Indeed, as one writer suggests, organizations practice dynamic conservatism. That is to say, they fight like hell to to remain the same. To offset this tendency, we produce short, snappy interim reports like this one and this one, instead of a final report like this. Now, if you present this to a minister, what are the odds on his reading it? Anyway, and this enabled us, in many cases, to have our recommendations considered, approved, implemented, and reported on in subsequent interim reports. As one way of facilitating an action orientation, we were determined to keep the public service both informed and involved. In each of our project teams and advisory groups, public servants were combined with outside consultants, academics, and businessmen and women to do the analysis and to make recommendations. Thus, many individuals most affected by the decisions emanating from the COGP studies had a major influence in determining the shape and course these decisions would assume. They therefore had more confidence in and a stronger commitment to change than they might otherwise have had. To help achieve transparency, the committee appointed liaison officers in each department and in each major special purpose body to act as communication links with the project. It used the public service paper Topical regularly to announce important developments. It made presentations to all senior staff on a number of occasions and developed a comprehensive communication program to inform all public servants of the organizational changes prior to or at the same time as public announcements. They didn't read about it later. One example of that, which I think I have here, was a little brochure, which is now up on the screen, and which I've put down somewhere. But you'll notice, or you may not notice, it received a little bit of publicity at the time because we didn't spell government correctly. And that actually made the CBC News. Now, that's what's known as getting free publicity. And, of course, they would say, if they can't even spell it, how can they reorganize it? These processes were developed to ensure that we had the support and trust of the people whose jobs were to be affected by the changes we proposed. But most important of all, the committee had a close and ongoing relationship with Cabinet as a whole, and in particular with the Premier, the Treasurer, and the Chairman of the Management Board. This support throughout the duration of the COGP project was absolutely critical in the committee's role as an effective change agent. Our success was thus premised on an openness to outside perspectives, performance which was judged on impacts rather than inputs or outputs, the development and trust and support from those we were studying, and ultimately a significant and public commitment from the political leaders of the day. The issues facing government in 1970 were identified by COGP as the heavy time demands on a minister's time, the demand for services outstripping available resources, the increasing interdependence of all government activities, managing in a varied, rapidly changing environment, effective utilization of human resources, the relationship between citizens and their government, the productive use of common services. The more things change, the more they remain the same, 40 years later. Time was the scarce resource, yet the committee recognized that a minister neither can nor should reduce their involvement as a member of the legislature, as a representative of a constituency, as a leading figure in a political party, or as a member of cabinet. Only his or her responsibility as a senior executive of a large and complex operating department lent itself to organizational remedy. The COGP therefore reached the conclusion that a new kind of minister was required, one who was completely relieved of the responsibilities and burdens of a chief executive of a department. Called Provincial Secretaries, these new ministers would derive their influence from membership on the Policy and Priorities Board, but would not have line control over the activities of their colleagues running the ministries. Thus, two distinct types of ministers were envisaged: policy ministers, called Provincial Secretaries, and ministers with program responsibilities. Once freed of the administrative responsibilities of a portfolio, Provincial secretaries would provide additional ministerial time to develop, evaluate, and coordinate policy among the various ministries. Provincial secretaries would also be in a position to devote considerably more time to achieving improvements in the linkages between government and citizens. Since most major sources of revenue had been tapped, we've learned more since, but at that time, had been tapped, the emphasis had to shift from finding new sources to making the best use of existing ones. To accomplish this, the COGP recommended the establishment of an improved priority-setting process, at the center of which would be a senior cabinet committee called the Policy and Priorities Board. The P&P Board was buttressed on the implementation side by the creation of the Management Board, combining the financial functions of the Treasury Board with the the Human Resources functions of the Civil Service Commission, and headed by a full-time minister. As one means of dealing with the increasing interdependencies of all government programs, the committee introduced the notion of policy fields. A policy field corresponds to a major mission of government and includes programs and activities for which basic objectives are substantially interrelated and complementary. As such, it is designed to improve coordination on major problems going beyond the jurisdiction of individual ministries. The three policy fields recommended by the committee were social development, resources development, and justice. The number of ministries included in each policy field varied from a minimum of 4 to a maximum of 6. There was no preconceived idea, but we wanted to make sure that it didn't increase the size of the cabinet. Now, if I could just divert for a moment, the notion was, rather than at the time when we came in, there used to be the cabinet was a very simple system. The group got together once a week, and individuals made proposals, sometimes almost on the back of an envelope, with very little in the way of projection. Certainly would be only the first year. Sometimes they'd wait until a minister that might oppose their project was out to the washroom, and things would move through pretty quickly. And part of the new system was to try and provide some buffers so that items would first go to a policy field committee, and you can see there are 3 of those represented there, and then it would go to the Policy and Priorities Board, and by the time it finally hit Cabinet, it would go through without any further discussion unless a minister wanted to have further discussion, because it might be that a minister from one of the other policy fields would have some objection or want some clarification, and that would happen. But other than that, it could be a fairly streamlined system. That was the theory. So complementing the establishment of policy fields was the formation of policy field committees composed of ministers within their respective policy field under the chairmanship of a provincial secretary. A primary objective in forming these committees was to ensure that potential conflicts, such as those that might arise between environmental considerations and economic growth, were recognized, thoroughly discussed, and to a significant extent resolved at a sub-cabinet level. Thus, ministers would spend increasing portions of their time dealing with those issues of the greatest concern to them. The majority of the ministries were contained in policy fields. However, there were 3 that were not. The Ministry of Treasury, Economics and Intergovernmental Affairs, which had an integrating role similar to those of a policy field in the areas of fiscal, regional, and intergovernmental affairs, and a Ministry of Revenue and a Ministry of Government Services. One last point to emphasize was the linkages between the various central decision-making bodies. And the Policy and Priorities Board was composed of the Premier, the Treasurer, the Chairman of Management Board, and the 3 provincial secretaries of each policy field, as you can see on the right-hand side. The Management Board was linked by common membership of the Treasurer and the Chairman of the Management Board, and then the Management Board had representatives of the various policy fields, but not the provincial secretaries. It would be far too ambitious and time-consuming for me to attempt a detailed explanation of the new ministries created in the reorganization. Suffice it to say that 17 ministries were created from 22 departments, and that the building blocks were programs, and the programs were put where it seemed that they made the most sense to have them together. COGP was able to work synergistically over 3 years to produce a series of 10 reports containing over 200 recommendations that sought to improve the management of the Government of Ontario. Virtually all of the recommendations were implemented by Premiers Robarts and Davis. Premier Davis, elected in 1971, helped ensure that by appointing the 5 senior deputy ministers into key roles in the new structure and making me, a non-political neophyte, his chief of staff, with the unusual title of Chief Executive Officer, Office of the Premier, and later on Secretary of the Cabinet. Time demands on a minister led to one innovative recommendation, greater in theory than in practice, that did not succeed, and that was, of course, the Provincial Secretaries. Provincial Secretaries were policy-only ministers who were chairs of the policy field cabinet committees and members of the Policy and Priorities Board of Cabinet, and were relieved of the time burden of running a ministry, thus freeing up more time for policy. This one did not work. With no grants to hand out and no ribbons to cut, the low profile of a provincial secretary was not attractive to politicians with a need for the public exposure felt necessary for re-election and the attainment of higher aspirations. By that I mean everyone figures they should be Premier. That and the fact that the Premier of the day appointed his 3 leadership rivals to these positions meant an early end to that experiment after a few years. But the need for ministerial time remains an unanswered challenge. One partial solution has been an increasing delegation of ministerial and management responsibilities to the deputy minister, particularly given the rotation of ministers. A joke that I like is the deputy minister's admonition to his assistant: if the minister calls, get the name. You just got it, eh? Our top recommendation. Now, I don't have time, nor you the patience, to review all 200 recommendations that flowed from the COGP and their impact, but let me mention just a few which remain very relevant. Our top recommendation was a full-scale reorganization of the cabinet decision-making process, the wholesale reconstitution of departmental structures, all of which generated and necessitated important changes in management and human resources policy. It reminds me of Peter Drucker. If you remember, he used to talk about doing things right and doing the right things. Well, the changes in the cabinet decision-making process, I think, helped doing the right things, and then we had to work better on the implementation side. Over the past 40 years, the cabinet committee structure still exists, and in 2010, Policy and Priorities has been reestablished following a short hiatus. Worth noting are the inclusion of caucus members on the committees of Cabinet, including some in the position of chair of the committee. Over the past 7 years, the use of results teams, adopted from the Tony Blair administration as a policy and delivery entity, has also been instituted. And these results teams are comprised not just of Cabinet ministers, but of senior public servants and external advisors. The first extension of government service delivery to the private sector, a move that was controversial at the time, but was a necessary step in ensuring that citizens received the most for their tax dollars. And finally, while today's talk of renewal is replete with words such as collaboration and private-public partnerships, we were there some 40 years ago when we called for the creation of these departmental review committees consisting roughly equal numbers of insiders and outsiders, and chaired by a private sector person. This approach applied not only to the committee staff, but also to the project teams and advisory groups. This was an approach followed by Premier Councils in the Peterson and Ray administrations, and one that has just begun to reappear with Premier McGuinty's introduction of the Health and Education panels. We were by no means clairvoyant, but we certainly tried to think ahead about the challenges that would develop in the province, especially as the economy shifted with growing global competition, by making recommendations that included the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. Foresight is a tough business to be in, but we demand it of our government leaders. Subsequent cabinet secretaries have put their own mark on government reform. Bob Carman, who had been involved in COGP, focused during his tenure from 1985 to 89 on developing a new culture in the Ontario Public Service and building senior management leadership that practiced corporate management across departmental silos. He also instituted pay for performance and output-based budget allocations. Where more revolutionary change was afoot, such as the Tomorrow Project in the late 1980s, political change disabled its ability to move forward. This ambitious project, led by then Secretary of Cabinet Peter Barnes, sought to rethink and restructure key central agencies to improve customer service and to investigate the role of technology in the improvement of government productivity. It was unfortunately cancelled as the winds of NDP change sifted through the Queen's Park. It differed from the COGP model in that the Tomorrow Project was mainly an inside-led exercise. We're fortunate to have with us today as a commentator Rita Burak, Special Advisor on Governance and Accountability in agencies, boards, and commissions, of which there's more than 200. Good luck. And a one-time Secretary of Cabinet in the Mike Harris government in the 1990s, who relit the flame for reform during her time in office. Her tenure at Queen's Park oversaw one of the most aggressive periods of cost-cutting and service reorganization that our province has seen. And while the legacy of some of these decisions continues to play out today, especially at the municipal level, her experience during a period of financial and economic instability lends itself very well to the current situation facing jurisdictions across Canada and beyond. And I just put that up because the blue line is the budget and the bottom line is the population, and it's scary. My earlier focus on the past shouldn't obscure the efforts and successes of post-COGP administrations. In Ontario, we are now the recipients of a dramatically improved citizen-centric service, notably through Service Ontario, and have a public service that is tied to performance contracts and mandate letters, helping push us toward the optimal level of service and value that citizens expect and deserve. Moreover, the inside-out lens of government is slowly being adapted to our times, with more and more governments, including our own in Ontario, adopting a citizens-first approach that privileges the outside-in view of what services citizens want and how they want them delivered. The growth and evolution of Service Ontario builds directly on these attempts to find out what aggravates citizens most. The Citizen First 5 project, organized by the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service, has led a series of Pan-American surveys aimed at finding just that out. Their results speak to the need for quick, efficient, and effective interactions with service providers. Canadians don't want to wait more than a day to receive an answer regarding a government service, request, or query. They don't want to spend more than 5 minutes in line, and they don't want to have to talk to more than 2 people to solve their problems. Given that Ontarians make over 46 million public sector service requests annually, this can't be taken lightly. The focus on the citizen and their demands has allowed the Ontario government to introduce the first government-backed service guarantee in North America. I think this is fantastic. Do you realize you can get your money back if you don't get your death certificate in 15 days? But such accolades and administrative gold medals aside, there is still much work to be done and many lessons and insights to be learned. My survey over the past year has taken in examples of reform and renewal from New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, and from across Europe, notably the United Kingdom. In each case, fiscal pressures and increasing demands for value from citizens have coalesced to incent searches for new ways of delivering services and the subsequent managerial, human resources, and operational changes necessary to enable that innovation. Tony Dean, the former Secretary of Cabinet for the Ontario Government and head of the Ontario Public Service, a designation, by the way, that I like. I think in practice that was the case for a long time. He incorporated it into the title of the job, and a great idea. And is now a fellow in residence at the University of Toronto's School of Public Policy and Governance, has done research on reform efforts in the United Kingdom, which offer a great deal of insight and advice for Canadian policymakers. Notably, progress requires a striking degree of innovation, self-reflection, and continuous improvement, all of which relies heavily on the extent of measurement, benchmarking, and public reporting on results. You need metrics. Transparency, while certainly a nominal risk to public service leaders and politicians alike, is key to providing the incentives for continuous improvement and measurement. Building cross-departmental capacity, information sharing, and understanding of how and where departments share jurisdictions and end clients is integral to ensuring that outcomes rather than inputs are the key measurable. And finally, leadership and political support from the top is essential. When prime ministers, premiers, and cabinet secretaries identify public service reforms as priorities and take responsibility for sustained leadership and monitoring of results, significant change follows. All of these are consistent with and certainly espoused by COGP. Now let me finish with some challenges for the future that speak to how the world has changed. Citizens are no longer passive recipients of legislation and information. They increasingly expect an active role and voice in how their tax dollars are used. Government needs to figure out how and what those roles will look like. New technologies offer an unprecedented capacity for ongoing dialogue and service delivery with and to constituents, but we mustn't do so just for the sake of it. Rather, we must discover what elements of the Web 2.0, 3.0, and social media offer citizens real value. The age of top-down command and control government has passed for both citizens and public service employees. Ideas more than power and vested interests matter. The impacts on employee retention and motivation cannot be neglected. Related to this is the need to pay significant attention to analyzing the incentives that drive a new generation of public sector employees. How have understandings and desires regarding compensation, hierarchy, and loyalty changed with the net generation? Moreover, analyzing how government works and how it could change cannot be an insular, inside-led process. Successful reform takes an outside-in perspective and leverages industry and not-for-profit best practices and insights in order to discover how to make government work better. Outcomes for citizens must direct inputs, not the other way around. Service Ontario's Citizens First focus is great, but this type of outcome-oriented measurement focused on the citizens' needs and wants must permeate government. Government reform necessitates top leadership support from both the political and bureaucratic arms of government. Moreover, the two arms must be in sync on the depth and breadth of reforms in order to gain the necessary support and trust for real action. Finally, what matters is the outcome to the citizen and the value produced for them by their tax dollars. Subsequently, we need to think less about the structures in place and more so about the structures that could be established to do so more effectively. As we approach a municipal election in Toronto, with each candidate promising the impossible, I can't help but think that a little dose of COGP scrutiny might be in order. I hope that today's conversation will be the beginning of a long and fruitful debate on how government and governance must change for the 21st century, and trust the Institute on Governance will be a fine host for research and analysis on the project. Before finishing, I want to particularly thank Dan Herman of the Institute on Governments, Carol Layton, Art Daniels, and past Cabinet Secretaries Bob Carman, Peter Barnes, Rita Burrock, and Tony Dean for their insights and assistance. And there are several COGP colleagues here today as well. Jerry I mentioned, Steve Otto I know is here, Peter Moore, who we got there? Malcolm Rowan, Peter Lyman, good. And so some of us have carried on. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and very much look forward to continuing this conversation with you as well as with our next two commentators, Rita Burrock as well as Danielle Jean, Deputy Minister of Administrative Services Review, Privy Council Office, and incoming Deputy Minister of Heritage. So thank you all very much. Right? Oh, yeah, I should sit down. You're right.
Get you some water.
Thank you.
You've been talking.
Thank you. Yeah, we can talk right here. So, Rita, what have you got to say?
Well, I'm mindful of the fact that I'm simply meant to generate some discussion, so I won't do a paragraph by paragraph critique of Jim's remarks, but I would like to make a couple of comments. And I'd like to be provocative, but I must confess I did agree with a lot, well, virtually everything you said.
But
I'm going to get to that later. No, I seriously don't have great points of disagreement, especially since you've acknowledged that the policy secretaries as a job wasn't going to fly, but that was a good effort. No, I want to say that as a person who lived through a big chunk of the 40 years post-COGP, it really was, for students of public administration, an incredible opportunity for government and folks in the private sector to actually take time out and seriously think about management in government, and many of the reforms that COGP brought about did stand the test of time. The cabinet committee structure, the new emphasis on HR. You had to be as old as me to understand what it was like prior to COGP. And the first thoughts about what information technology might mean to the future of government. And the reforms really were extraordinary for their time. I also want to say that it really is important for someone of your stature to acknowledge that the Ontario Public Service has been on a journey of modernization over a period of time. And just as the baton of reform and modernization was passed to me by Bob Carman and Peter Barnes and Ed Stewart, I was able to pass the baton to Tony Dean and Andromache and now Shelley. And there is a recognition in the public service that this is a journey. You know, you'll never be there. Each generation is going to make new improvements in customer service and HR and all of the above. But there is not a lot of public acknowledgement for that. And so to have someone of your stature say, you know, I've looked at it and progress is being made is really, really important. I do want back to your actual speech, just two brief comments. You mentioned in your speech that there were a lot of circumstances today that perhaps mirror what the province faced in 1995, and that is economic uncertainty. The Bank of Canada has just come out with a not so hopeful forecast. The province has a very large deficit, very high level of debt. And when I think about what we had to do in 1995 to respond to the incoming government's determination to deal with the deficit in a relatively short period of time, it was very, very tough. Some would say brutal. But the public service of the day rose to the challenge, and in a certain sense, that level of change and reduction forced us to be innovative in terms of public sector management, and I think the public service of today will be called upon to do the very same thing. I can't help but get this one additional suggestion in as we're talking about governance and how we can make government better. And if I had to give advice to the government that has to deal with the deficit in over the next couple of years, I would say don't make the assumption that the general public really does get it. Yes, there are a lot of articles in the newspaper about the fact that healthcare is 40% of the budget, but nobody has any idea what the pie of your tax dollar actually looks like. They don't really understand the implications of over 40% of the budget going into healthcare and what that means for what's left. And the public service does. So in a perfect world, there would be a collaboration among the political side, the civil service, people from academia, and the private sector who would, before decisions are taken, go through an exercise of helping the public understand this. You still have to feed the prisoners in the schools. You have to put gas in the OPP cars. You have to have the mine rescue team ready up at Red Lake. So when I think about modernization, I have to tell you that the overwhelming frame for the next steps in modernization in government have to be how one will do this at a time when we're coping with a large deficit and increasing levels of debt. My final comment, because we are meant to be brief, would be I certainly liked the question you posed about how, in this very new age from the age that I worked in, is shaping up. How do we incent that next generation of public sector leaders? And I know that the Ontario Public Service has done an incredible amount of good work in that regard since I've been gone, and we've managed to turn around and get more young people into the public service. I would just hope in the ways that we go about this, we don't lose and let the next generation lose the fact that public service is a kind of calling. You're never going to get the pay levels and the sharp offices and the technology that you might get in the private sector. There's got to be some heart in the public service, and I hope the next generation will find that heart. So
Yep.
I hope I haven't overstepped my time limit, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you. I'd like to reflect on your remarks, Jim, a bit through the lens of what I've been through for the last 6 months. And thank God my mandate is not as broad as yours was. But I think I'd like to make kind of 5 points that, in my view, when I read your remarks yesterday in preparing for today, I thought that it was very interesting how current they are 40 years later, and certainly in the context of what I've done. So what is my context? Speech from the throne, budget 2010. The government has asked me to do a review of administrative services. There are primarily two drivers. One is how to enhance services to citizens, so the service experience. And the other one is to see how we can reduce the cost of administrative services in the government, so a fiscal thing. Looking at your remarks and what was done 40 years ago, it seems to me there's 5 points I'd like to make. Governance still matters. Measuring whether it's outcomes and benchmarks still very much matters. Citizen-driven matters more than ever. Driving sustainable execution continue to be a challenge, I think, for government. And leadership still matters. Now, on governance, I like to think that the fact that the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, and the President of the Treasury Board is my audience for my report does matter. and I would also think it mattered when I had to recruit a team, started on my own in April, and I was able to recruit 25 people free of charge from various department agencies in 3 weeks. So I think the fact I had the weight of the Prime Minister and the Clerk of the Privy Council behind did matter. I also think it matters because when I looked at where we are challenged, which is being able to take an approach whereby the government is seen as an entity, not a multitude of entities for the citizens, or where it comes time to manage ourselves from a common infrastructure or common administrative services, we can do it in both a less expensive but also a clever way. I think governance matters because as much as we are at the federal level been very clever in creating a small committee of deputy ministers that always look forward where we want to go on the policy side, we haven't been as skillful to do it on the management side. So that's something that's coming out of my review and was very much there 40 years ago. Outcomes and benchmark. I find very interesting when we did our literature review, Sir Peter Gershom, who did similar review to what you did 40 years ago, what we're doing right now in the UK in 2004, just did as a consultant review on the information technology in Australia, said the biggest problem is the countries, governments usually don't have a standardized way of coding how they spend. And therefore, if you don't have that, you don't have a chart of accounts, you don't know where you're spending your money. And a deputy minister of mine 20-something years ago told me, if you can't count, you can't manage. So we are still challenged here today, and it's true for us, it's true for many jurisdictions. Citizen-driven, it's been very interesting in the context of our exercise to see how we continue in the government to be driven by the how we want to provide services as opposed to the way that clients wants to be served. And that, I think, it's a shift that in government we need to do, both for citizens and small businesses. On driving execution, what has struck us in doing our work is how we need to sharpen our skills and sharpen the tools, the same way that I think private sector organizations would do that. And why does leadership matter? I think leadership matters, and I think to a large extent that's what you were trying to do 40 years ago, and that's what we're still trying to do. Leadership matters because it's about creating the right environment for people to achieve things. And when I look, I was invited to give a lecture to a class of MBA students an hour ago, and they were asking me about career in the public service. And I'm very happy to say that the people that are coming in the public service right now, they are bright and they are energetic. Where their patience is very limited is they're very impatient if we're not giving them a stimulating opportunity to make a difference. And that's where I would leave my remarks. Why not? Why not giving them an opportunity to make a difference?
Good, thank you. Now we'd like to open it up. If there's any questions or short comments?
We've got a mic. Just raise your hand and we'll bring you the mic. You don't have to do anything scary. You can even stay seated if you want.
Usually a group like this isn't too bashful. Yes.
Where, Dave?
I probably don't need a mic. I'll speak up. I worked in Nunavut as that organization got going, or that new government got going. And we were very frustrated in the health and social services area, funded by the federal government, at the measurement of things that were small expenditures, and a worry, for example, in home care that we might spend a third, a half of the budget on measuring. One of the profs in Ottawa talks about quantumania as a disease in the federal government, and my concern would be that we be careful of what we're measuring. I think the public would be very interested to know that 90 cents on every dollar spent in Nunavut comes from the federal level. And looking at how to manage that and manage it down or differently would be probably more important than measuring that little old home care program.
I was just wondering, seeing back 40 years ago and seeing the policy ministries that you started, that sort of brought back memories of that. But what seems to be a difficult thing in sort of the modern times, or as things have become more complicated, is the so-called horizontal management issue. And I just wondered from the three of you whether it was easier back then, because if you were dealing with policy, if we were dealing with the policy ministry concept then, it was an issue then. But I think it's become much more complicated as many more people have to participate in decisions that are made, and as it goes through the whole cabinet and government process. So have we been able to keep up in terms of the challenges in that route, or are we kind of weighted down by a lot of hands involved in making policy?
Well, I'm dated in terms of that. Although there's no doubt that the complexity is greater, but often the principles remain the same. I mean, I find even as you get more complex, one of the skills, I guess, of a good policy person is cutting through to the essentials of the issues that are involved. And so it's a challenge, but I think a surmountable one.
Why don't I start? And actually, there is a former cabinet secretary here who I believe really put an effort into moving the yardsticks on that topic, and that is Tony Dean. So let's draw Tony Dean into this. But
can we bring you the mic, Tony?
That continues to be a challenge, surprisingly, even today in an age of instant communication. And I think it's a combination of getting the structures right, whether it's through cabinet committees or what have you, and how we incent the senior leadership to make sure that they are thinking horizontally. But it is quite it's surprising that in this day and age we do still have relative compartmentalization of issues. But I do want to give Tony credit for his work in that regard.
Well, I like. First of all, it's really interesting that 40 years ago this was a priority, and it's as big a priority today as it was then. I think we have made some progress. We've made some progress in some places, working both across ministry and departmental boundaries. We've made some progress in the larger project of working across jurisdictional boundaries and actually talking with and working with our colleagues at the municipal and federal level. And we've made some progress in working across professional boundaries, in the sense that, I was in government for a while, and we would still kind of spend a lot of time developing policies and then get it kind of right. And then somebody would say, well, how much is this going to cost? And we'd kind of move to the fiscal piece. And then we'd get that sorted out, and somebody would say, well, how are we going to communicate this now? All of those things happen in parallel right now. So policy, communications, thinking about marketing is happening in a very, very joined up way. The problem that we have is we still have ministerial silos and the architecture of kind of stovepiped government at all levels. And the forces of conservatism are so great, and Jim mentioned this, that if leaders take their foot off the gas for a second, everybody pulls back into their silos. And that's particularly the case when people are nervous and we're looking at changing government. Interestingly enough, right now, in the context in the UK of 25 to 30% departmental cuts, all Tony Blair's years of efforts to join up government are evaporating in days as people look inwardly and start to think about how their department will survive, just at the moment that we should be at our most horizontal. So it's kind of interesting. It's an ongoing challenge. It's as important today as it was then, but it's as big a challenge to sustain today as it was back then. So terrific question.
Got our last question right here.
Sorry, Todd Kane from the Institute. Thank you all for your participation. Dr. Fleck, your opening remarks early on, you talked about how your point of departure was the minister's role as the chief executive is what lends itself to an organizational solution. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what's changed in the other four hats that ministers wear today that you think have implications for the challenges of modernizing in the environment today.
Interesting question. Certainly, you see, it's because the individual ministers often have this aspiration, as I said, to be the head guy or gal, that therefore they don't want to miss the opportunity to be an important part of their party, which means going out to the fundraising events at all the different ridings, etc. So I don't see that changing a great deal. In terms of the cabinet, there's a little easing with the policy fields because you don't have to deal with everything all the time. You have to be aware of it, but you don't have to deal with it. Time in the legislature, I would say that's one that's been reduced to a considerable extent. They still have question period, and even there have been attempts to try and make it so the prime minister or premier only has to come one day a week or something of that sort. So there are efforts made to reduce the time there somewhat. And of course, the sixth hat that I usually talk about, in addition to the 5 hats, is family. And that one is very tough. So it gets cut back. So I don't see, and with the constituency, again, remember, it's the constituents that re-elect the minister. And so we had our previous prime minister from out in Alberta, I guess, and if those folks didn't re-elect him, he was out of office. So, and constituents usually expect instant, fast reactions to their needs and wants. So it's tough to modify that one as well. So I'm not saying that. I still think time is the key resource that is so scarce. And of course, that's why in some ways I hate to see ministers waste some of it. I might say when I started working with Bill Davis, one of the things I realized, his wife didn't necessarily think it was a good idea, but he had this time coming in from Brampton each day in the car. So I drove out to Brampton first thing in the morning. The OPP guy took my car, and I got in the car with the Premier, so I had an hour with him before he got into work. But that was taking advantage of that time opportunity. Otherwise, he might have slept or done something like that.
Well, ladies, thank you very much for that very exciting conversation that reminds us not only of 40 years ago, but today. It's my job to wrap up now because we have some celebrating to do around this inaugural lecture. From what everyone has said on the panel, modernizing government is a journey that started probably several hundred years ago, although we only had an hour today, so we didn't want to go that far back, when a bunch of unruly and overtaxed warlords met King John on the field of battle. It's an ongoing journey, and there's no question about that. What's interesting in today's reflections is that as topical as those discussions were 40 years ago, there has been some progress made. But the challenges are as great today as they've ever been, notwithstanding everything we have at our disposal. And as Tony pointed out, the silos rule, and we better be very careful in the next year how we manage those silos, because we may set ourselves back if we're not seized with the conservatism of any large organization, not only in government, but in the private sector and anywhere else. That's why large organizations exist, to defend themselves. So the challenges we have today and have been brought in sharp focus are the financial and fiscal pressures that governments face, the generational change, which we haven't said a lot about today, but maybe can look into in future, because things are changing. And in those changes, there are opportunities and there are also maybe pitfalls, as Rita points out to us. We have very different ways of working today. We have new skills and we have new tools that the technology provides. But have we yet got the right incentives and the right incentives for execution across the whole of government kind of sphere? And more importantly, again, today we heard the clarion call to all of these changes being done against the core values of what public service is all about, because in truth, those probably haven't changed. And once again, we concluded with a very important lesson, which is that leadership matters and that leadership must be constant. So I hope you'll agree with me that this has been a very successful launch of the Flecture at the Flectrium. As Eddie Nason, who heads up our Toronto office, he's young, he's hip, and he's cool, and that's how he's named it. Today I want to thank our illustrious panel. So thank you very much to Rita and Danielle of their time, and Danielle especially for coming down from Ottawa. I want to thank Shelley Aaronworth, whose original idea this was. I want to thank Dan Herman, Mary Lloyd, and my colleagues at the Institute on Governance for making this possible. I also want to thank the great folks at the Rotman School for all the support they've given us. They run a great tight ship. And finally, I want to thank that great probing, inquiring mind, that great teacher to all of us, and he has literally been a teacher to many of us, our modern and vital nation builder, Jim Fleck. So for the first Flecture, it was a great success. And we'll do all the appropriate things now to make sure that the wisdom that's been shared here with us today goes out to the world. It's been webcast today, but we'll make sure that in the ways of government, hard copies do follow. So, Jim, we don't know if we'll always hold the Flecture at the Flectrium. And by the way, it's the Flectrium because this, too, is a commitment of Jim to higher education, the Rotman School, a gift from him. We will search out excellence across the country and try to find preeminent men and women who will follow your lead to take on next year's Flecture. as it will forever now be named. So thank you very much. Let's go and celebrate a bit. There's a little bit of wine and a little bit of things to accompany it at the back. And let's join the conversation on a personal level that we've enjoyed from the three up here on the panel. So thank you very much.